Each mage practicing their craft must always be mindful of their use of magic. If they are to operate within the confines of reality, they must ensure that what they do cannot stray too far from what is deemed realistic, or they may suffer the backlash of paradox as reality violently lashes out against them. To understand paradox, we must first understand the difference between coincidental and vulgar magic. These are very broad terms, of course, but they can be easily boiled down to a sort of Boolean answer. Is the magic challenging the consensus of reality? If yes, then it is vulgar. If no, it is coincidental. Naturally, the actual science behind this is much more complex, and there are multiple theories as to what does and does not constitute a breach of consensus. For example, let's say you have some money on your nightstand and you are in a coffee shop needing to pay for your frappuccino. Realizing you are out of money, you employ your mastery of the spheres to teleport some of that change into your pocket so that you may pay for your beverage. Is this a challenge to consensus? It may be, depending entirely on how plausible it would be for there to be money in your pocket, and whether the money disappearing off your nightstand is going to be seen or noticed. There are two schools of approach to observing this, however, and I will need to be a bit meta to explain them. In the community of Mage the Ascension players, there are two approaches to consensus: the HAB and the HOO, the hypothetical average bystander and the hypothetical omniscient observer. The HAB is the gentler of the two, as it dictates that any magic done so that the average bystander won't suspect it to be out of order is automatically coincidental. Unless you were unfortunate in that the money on your nightstand disappeared in front of your spouse, or that you had walked through a metal detector before entering the coffee shop, there shouldn't be any problems. It is not an unusual thing for people to have change in their pockets after all. This can be extended to many different things. Perhaps a gas main under the street ruptured, and that was the cause of the sudden and destructive explosion. Or maybe the bullet ricocheting improbably against a corner and hitting the fleeing suspect was instead fired by a sniper assisting the police. In short, HAB allows for a wider leeway of coincidental magic, as it relies on those around the mage and the effect they cause to accept the effect of magic as part of reality. The HOO is by far a crueler taskmaster, however, because it stipulates that reality itself is the judge of what is vulgar and not, regardless of there being witnesses. To HOO, it doesn't matter if no one saw you teleport that money. Reality knows that money cannot travel that way, and thus it will punish you for it with paradox. In a sense, HOO is a strong supporter of the technocracy and how they operate. After all, they seek to explain their magic with science, and what is science if not an extension of consensus? Science explains what is physically possible, and teleportation may in fact be. It just needs to be complicated and difficult and most likely very limited. At least for now. Magic operating under HOO is therefore under very strict surveillance at all times. Reality cannot be fooled through persuasion, but a sufficiently clever wielder of magic, and player for that matter, might be able to conjure up the appropriate circumstances of how they were able to leap those extra feet to reach the other rooftop. This dichotomy of HAB and HOO is most likely the reason why so many people consider Mage the Ascension a difficult game. One may subconsciously accept either model as the appropriate way to play the game, which will therefore color almost every aspect of it. In HAB, the game is far more fantastical and easy, while in HOO, it is much more grounded in reality, with magic always coming at a steep price. Naturally, the definition of vulgar and coincidental varies much depending on where, when, and how a person is doing the magic in question. If done amongst people who, hypothetically, would have little problem accepting that the mage is the chosen of whatever deity or entity beyond the stars they are worshipping, the risk of that mage's magic being vulgar is lessened. Contrariwise, if a mage stands in the middle of Times Square and teleports hundreds of rolls of cheese around them, the paradoxical backlash would be almost assuredly fatal. There is one other effect of magic which I have not mentioned, and it is the mundane. Magic that is so common and thus so taken for granted that it is no longer considered extraordinary. Consider instant messaging, or airplanes. Inconceivable in the past, yet so everyday that we rarely stop to consider what marvels they are today. Much of what magic the technocracy employs are marvels of science and ingenuity that they often hope to introduce into human society at the appropriate time, and under their firm control, of course. Thus they will turn their marvelous inventions into mundane and convenient quality of life for the average citizen, none of them any wiser of how impossible such a thing was a scant few years ago. But let us return to the subject of paradox. In the past, there was no such thing as paradox. Reality was much more malleable, and perhaps more importantly, humanity was far from as united and connected as we are today. Groups of people living together could have radically different worldviews from others, and this in turn meant that mages could wield significantly more power without fear of repercussions from nature. Backlash was once what mages feared the most, having their powers turn on them should they fail in wielding them. Lacking their proper will, training, or skill, a mage could accidentally unleash powers far beyond their scope, and thus suffer the effect of it themselves as if kicked by a bucking stallion. By the time of the Renaissance, the Order of Reason, the predecessors to the Technocracy, had worked its influence to the point where the Scourge, a sort of progenitor of paradox, was a threat. At this point in history, mages could still get away with much of what they could in the past, as long as the people close to them were willing to believe in it. The Scourge was not in a sense a bad force either, rather it could even help improve a mage's effort should they align with local beliefs, or be outrageous enough. Yet in the 1600s, during the Battle of Naseby of the First English Civil War, everything would change. The amount of vulgar magic being flung against opposing forces became so high that the Scourge turned into what we today call paradox. No longer capable of benevolent support, paradox would from then on only seek to punish any mage who would resort to vulgar magic that affected the common beliefs held about it. Paradox comes in many forms. Sometimes it will be actual physical punishment done upon the body of the mage. And while painful, this is usually one of the least bad ways that reality will whip you into line. Unless, of course, you cause enough disturbance to be popped like a balloon. One must realize, of course, that reality is not a conscious being as we see it. It does not cherry-pick who or what to punish, it simply tries to streamline itself. Imagine bubbles of air trapped in laminate. Sometimes the bubbles are so small that they don't matter much. Other times reality might decide to do a do-over and just completely wipe the slate clean, you along with it. Or perhaps it is conscious. This is after all a hotly debated topic among mages, as it has also many times decided to punish particularly arrogant and harmful mages by transporting them into so-called paradox realms, small worlds created solely for the purpose of tormenting the offender and to remind them of their hubris. Worlds composed entirely of matchsticks or realms of complete stasis where no life can flourish and no irregularity is allowed. Sometimes they might even send paradox spirits to track a mage down and punish them, and although these spirits seem paradoxical themselves, they are allowed to exist by reality to ensure that the mage is punished properly. Other effects of paradox could be less harmful but still strange. A mage might have their physical form altered in some way that will fit into consensus, of course. Paradox would never turn someone into a centaur or a dragon. Or they might even be driven insane through quiet, a magical form of madness that overwhelms the mage with feelings of regret and guilt over their arrogance. Of course, that's a simple explanation. In fact, there are 3 different forms of quiet, based upon the metaphysic trinity known to werewolves as the Will, the Weaver, and the Wyrm. These 3 forms are madness, clarity, and jour, dynamic, static, and entropic quiet. Madness traps a mage in an illusionary world of raw change and chaos. These bouts can be heavily influenced by the resonance of the mage, and likewise may result in sporadic creations of hobgoblins and other minor magical effects as the mind of the mage goes haywire. A mage suffering from stasis is unable to perceive viewpoints different from theirs. They become hyper-focused on their own perception of reality and pursue their goals with a kind of mania rarely seen, and unless brought out of it, a stasis-afflicted mage may lose themselves completely to the patterns of stasis, becoming a drone, possessed by a weaver spirit much like a Fomori. Jour, finally, is the entropic quiet, and it manifests in an utter obsession with death and the dead. This often affects the Euthanatoi, who thankfully have learned to detect such behavior and methods to help their fellow magi process it. Unlike the Euthanatoi, these entropic mages may desire to end death completely, or otherwise disrupt the cycle of life and death, often with disastrous results. Naturally, paradox is not present everywhere. It is significantly weaker in the umbral realms and other places where spirits dwell. Spirits, after all, are by their definition supernatural, and thus their realm is less affected by consensus. Most humans, after all, don't believe in spirits. Mages are also able to enter parallel worlds and dimensions called shard realms. These are technically still umbral in their nature, and are, interestingly, each connected to a planet in the solar system, even Pluto, despite it apparently no longer counting as one. They are also aligned with spheres as well, meaning that magic from that particular sphere is extra powerful in that shard realm. Thus, a mage using entropy magic on Pluto would have a significantly easier time to do so, reality allowing for more outrageous effects than, say, if they were doing it on Mercury, the correspondence shard realm, or Earth. Earth, by the way, at least its shard realm representation, is also the realm of Prime, although this place should not be confused with the Earth we are currently living on. Often one wonders how it is possible for werewolves, vampires, and ghosts to exist if reality does not tolerate irregularities. One must simply accept then that these creatures are allowed to exist despite the seemingly unawareness of humanity. Does this in turn mean that consensus is in fact divorced of humanity's collective unconsciousness? And if that is true, then does it merely exist as means of punishment to those mortals who consider themselves gods and fly too close to the proverbial sun? As with everything in the world of darkness, reality is what you make of it, and no mage has ever been able to prove with full certainty how reality truly operates. This video was brought to you by my patron, the antediluvian Procyon, who wished to learn more about the elusive and poorly understood topic of paradox. I hope this has aided you in shedding some light on the issue. Thank you so much for your support.